speaker has an extensive experience in his career across IT, software development, telecoms, and cybersecurity. And he is currently responsible for developing and managing the Integrity 360 Group's portfolio of cybersecurity services and solutions. Give a warm welcome to the Director of Product Management at Integrity 360, Brian Martin.
Good morning, everyone, and delighted to be here in this lovely venue. I'm going to talk about exposure. And exposure, I think we all have a sense that some of it is inevitable. You can't get rid of all exposure, but too much exposure is dangerous. So what I'm going to cover today, a bit like this unfortunate chicken in here has suffered a bit too much exposure. I'm going to talk about what exposure is, the different types of exposure we should be aware of, how attackers leverage exposure, because that's critical in terms of understanding that, so you can actually prioritize how to address it, how to put in place more structured threat exposure management processes, and summarize at the end just what are the key points I'd like you all to take away today. So what is exposure? Well, in my eyes, exposure, Rich gave a couple of very good definitions, and if you boil it down in terms of the cybersecurity context, exposure is anything that may be exploited by a bad actor to achieve their goals and their objectives. So that widens the lens, if you like, in terms of what you need to look at, because anything can be exploited. So yes, of course, vulnerabilities are in the mix, but there's so many other types of exposure across businesses that also need to be considered and that are leveraged every day by threat actors to penetrate your defenses. So if you think about the typical modern organization, there's quite a complex attack surface there now. So you look at the likes of public cloud, private cloud, on-premise devices and infrastructure. You've got your mobile devices running applications with sensitive data running on them. Your workers are everywhere. They're in the office, they're at home, they're in cafes, they're on the train. And there's a whole area of identities and permissions, which is part of the attack surface as well. And it's not just IT. Most organizations now have some elements of IoT and OT infrastructure as well. So what we try and do as security people is we try and put protection around all of that, and see this as a logical protection, so not necessarily just an external perimeter, but protections ingrained across the entire attack surface, internal and external. But of course, we all know that there's no such thing as perfect protection, so therefore we have security monitoring, we have detection, we have response to cater for when those protections get penetrated. So when you think about exposure then, exposure are those gaps that you have in your protection that can be leveraged to gain whatever access is that the threat actor wants to gain access to. And detection and response can respond to that, but unfortunately, from time to time, even that isn't sufficient in order to mitigate a negative outcome from a cybersecurity perspective. So there's this, I kind of see it as a sort of a dance going on between protection and detection and response and exposure management that every organization needs to grapple with, because you need all three, and I think an understanding of all three and a strategy that puts all three together is really the organization that is going to mitigate the most risk. Vulnerability management is a crucial part of exposure management, and unfortunately it's a problem that's not going away. In recent years, the number of new CVEs being published has grown, and it's actually turning into a bit of a exponential curve. And if there's one thing that, dealing with customers of ours, we find that most organizations struggle with the sheer volume of dealing with the new vulnerabilities that are coming to light and having the capacity to deal with all of that and to keep ahead of it. And it's almost like a, one step forward, two steps backwards sort of situation. So as Gartner say, fixing every known vulnerability has always kind of been operationally infeasible. And that really points towards having some form of ability to rationally prioritize. But as I alluded to, vulnerabilities is really only one form of exposure. There are many, many types of exposures. You've got misconfigurations, you've got identities and permissions, someone who's got excessive permissions, someone who belongs to the wrong group, identities that can get compromised, lack of MFA, things like that. Security controls that have failed. Who hasn't had an endpoint solution that's fallen over and nobody was aware of it? So basically you had an unprotected device. SaaS misuse. SaaS is a whole new attack surface that we're dealing with and is another form of exposure that has to be dealt with. People. Our people are an exposure. Security awareness. Clicking on that phishing link that you shouldn't click on, clicking on that dodgy URL. That's an exposure that is very often exploited, and we know that a huge percentage of attacks start or have some form of phishing involved. Physical security is an exposure. If you have poor physical security, then it's incredibly easy for someone to get onto your network, get inside your environment. Supply chain risk. So we're embedding third-party libraries and technologies into our environment. Many organizations use service providers who gain access to the environment, who use contractors. So again, a whole massive supply chain there is another large area of exposure. Credentials, leaked passwords on the dark web that can then be leveraged for password spray attacks and things like that is an exposure. And as Rich was talking about AI, we've got the promise of AI and the hype of AI, but then also potentially the exposures that it brings as well need to also be taken into account. So in summary, around that initial introduction, from an exposure point of view, I think security leaders need to become CEOs. And you're probably sitting there going, yeah, I am ambitious, but I'm not sure if I want to go all the way to the top. So what I really mean is Chief Exposure Officer. All security leaders need to become Chief Exposure Officers because they need to have that mindset, looking at their environment, their company, and new initiatives and new technologies, and not just look at it from the perspective of what it's going to bring to the table, but also potentially what new exposures it's going to bring. So, just try to move on here. Yeah, no presentation is complete without a meme. So I applied the idea of the security mindset, the Chief Exposure Officer mindset to AI. And as you can see, the business getting very excited about the concept of all of the productivity gains, the creativity gains associated with AI. However, also the security leadership needs to consider from an exposure perspective what that brings. So the Chief Exposure Officer mindset AI does create new exposures around unauthorized access, the impact of a breach. So what happens if someone in your organization gets breached? Now suddenly there's a natural language interface in order to gain access to all of that insight sitting within that large language model that has gone out around the organization and pulled it all together in a very easy, accessible environment. So that puts huge pressure on the hardening of information governance, data classification and labeling, access permissions, so that both internally your staff don't get access to information they shouldn't be getting access to, but then also if there is a breach, that information also becomes much more readily accessible to the threat actor. Because AI turbocharges exposure exploitation as well, so And we're already seeing the likes of examples of deep fakes and being used in social engineering. And whilst it's still not fully there yet, as Rich was saying, it's only a matter of time before AI will enhance, whether through helping the threat actors develop those tools, or in some case, AI-led automation coming into the picture as well in due course. But then also the exposure mindset being also to help mitigate the exposure. So AI can certainly help with exposure visibility. Wouldn't it be great if you could ask the AI, tell me what are my top vulnerabilities, which of those are the most exploited, which ones should I fix first? If you had a really strong, credible AI that could do that for you, that would be hugely powerful. So there is a lot of development going on in the AI tooling to help with all of that, and the co-pilotization of the SOC, if you like, so to help enhance the capabilities of your team so that they can much more quickly deal with incidents and investigate with the use of these tools as well. So lots of different ways in which you can look at AI from a chief exposure officer perspective. And just taking an analogy now with in the non-cyber world, thinking about exposures. And there was a hugely tragic situation last June where the Titan submersible imploded while it was diving to visit the Titanic, with the tragic loss of 5 lives. Now, if you look at that from an exposure management perspective, you had exposures like it was a novel carbon fiber hull. There was an acrylic viewport that had not been certified for the depth to which it was being used. It was probably the first time carbon fiber had been used in a submersible. Typically, it's titanium was being used. However, there was a carbon fiber titanium structure interface, if you like, which again was an exposure point because of that interface between the two. There was no safety certification, so if you don't know you're exposed, if you're not certified, if you haven't actually had an objective evaluation of the security, then you're not really certified. You're not really, you've got a definite exposure around that uncertainty. They did have detection and response in place, so they had a whole monitoring system, which in fairness, it was really meant to pick up on defects in the carbon fiber that would emerge over time. But what actually happened was it imploded, and the best estimates were the whole submersible imploded in 1 millisecond. So effectively the detection and response wasn't suitable for the exposure that was there. So it's kind of important to understand that some exposures can't be effectively mitigated by detection and response, in which case you really need to up your game on the exposure side in those areas where you cannot depend on detection and response. And so the same is very, very true in this case and also in cybersecurity. And what do attackers do? Then they chain exposures to build attack paths. It's very unlikely really that there's just one exposure. Now it does happen, of course, but typically attackers chain exposures. So most of us will have heard of and be familiar with the monitor attack framework that categorizes and documents all the main attacker tactics that are used. Things like reconnaissance and initial access, privilege escalation, lateral movement, etc. And a whole range of techniques that they use underneath each of those tactics to achieve their goals. And very often it's exposures that are being leveraged in order to get through the attack chain. Even in our own red teaming exercises, which uses the white hat techniques to demonstrate to customers where they have exposures and vulnerabilities. They use exactly the same approach. They use multiple exposures to get initial access, to enumerate what's around there, see what the vulnerabilities are, what the exploits are, what the misconfigurations are. And therefore, just putting one defense on the outside perimeter just is never going to be enough, because once that's penetrated, then multiple exposures internally will also be leveraged to go further within your environment. And unfortunately, exposure management can be seen and can be felt like it's a bit of a game of whack-a-mole, where no sooner have we got rid of one exposure than another one pops up somewhere else. And so the key question, I think, in exposure management is actually how we remediate, how we prioritise the remediation of exposures. And if you look at just general risk management, typically in risk management, risk is probability times impact, and you prioritise the things that have the highest risk score. So if you translate that into exposure management, it's the criticality of the exposure. It's the likelihood of exploitation times the impact of the exploitation. And there are many factors that impact the criticality of the exposure. So obviously the impact, really important. The criticality of the asset. Are there active exploits in the wild that are targeting this particular exposure? And then crucially, is this exposure present in multiple attack paths? Because there are many paths within an environment to get to the crown jewels within the environment. And very often, if there's an exposure that's common across multiple attack paths, then that can really help drive the prioritization, because with that one remediation, you can actually significantly reduce the risk as compared to many other exposures that might be around that are only involved in a single attack path. But it's definitely the case that, I often hear, oh, well, that was an internal system, and therefore, it wasn't really important that we patched that system or that we got rid of that exposure. It's not a critical asset. It's not externally facing. Therefore, we don't need to worry about it too much. The reality is that may be true, but it can also be a stepping stone within the environment to get to somewhere else that can actually get to a critical asset. So that factor needs to be brought into the equation as well. Another example, I seem to, when I finished this, I realized I was having lots of examples about maritime disasters, so apologies for that. But here's an example of an exposure, another non-cyber example, where these officers on the Titanic are a bit concerned about someone tripping on these deck chairs. So you can almost see that is an exposure, and there's a threat looming on the horizon that we're all familiar with. Of course, the critical exposure was the fact that the ship, even though it was deemed unsinkable and was probably one of the best designed ships of its time, the bulkheads weren't watertight, and the reason for that was more a design ethos around not having bulkheads going all up to, inside the passenger decks. And the reason was they figured that if there was a head-on collision, that they could have actually 4 compartments at the front end penetrated, and it still wouldn't sink. What actually happened, because they turned the ship at the last minute, that 6 of the compartments got flooded, which meant that the water was able to traverse into the remaining bulkheads, come in over the top of each bulkhead, and ultimately the ship sank. So in effect, you could see that they had a sort of a breach assumption, or no, they had a no breach assumption. And we all know from the principles of zero trust is that you always assume breach. But there was an invalid no breach assumption there. And once, the threat, which is the combination of the iceberg and the water, penetrated that initial defense, it moved laterally with devastating consequences. And then again, inadequate response plan, 20 lifeboats with places for only 1,100 people. There was over 2,200 people on board. There was also a lot of confusion around the processes, so they didn't really have really clear defined processes. So on one side of the ship, they were saying women and children first. On the other side of the ship, it was women and children only. So there was confusion between the officers as to what the policy was. It resulted in many boats going out half empty. And actually, as you can see here, only 60% of the places on lifeboats were actually used. So many hundreds of lives could have been saved with better planning and alignment around how to respond. But the fact was they didn't have enough lifeboats because they never expected it to happen. So they had really was a half-hearted response plan that they never expected to use, which I think there's a lot of lessons there we can learn in the world of cybersecurity. But I think the key point from this is I want to say is that you've got to think about, you can't really make any assumptions about nobody's going to get to this place, if you like. So you need to think about the whole attack chain and not just make some invalid assumptions about no breach in certain areas of your environment. So what is exposure management? There's three main pillars to threat exposure management. It's the one we all know and love, which is vulnerability management, everything from asset discovery, vulnerabilities, prioritization, and patching. Crucially, understanding and managing the attack surface is a key component of threat exposure management that's really coming into the frame now. So it's about the external attack surface, the full attack surface, not just the vulnerabilities on externally facing assets. It's your cyber asset attack surface, so everything internally, whether it be IT, IoT, OT, etc. Understanding attack paths, so that traversal within your environment, leveraging multiple exposures to get to your crown jewels. Rich talked about the cloud and the continued rise of cloud, so your cloud security posture management, very much a component of exposure management and managing the attack surface. Even digital risk and brand abuse and people stealing credentials and leaking credentials on the dark web all form part of the attack surface as well. They need to be factored. Your supply chain and your people and so forth. The list is actually quite long, but really is important to consider all aspects of exposure when you're thinking about exposure management. And then the third crucial pillar is around testing and validating. So validating the exposures you've fixed, whether that's testing for the patches and the vulnerabilities, testing your people, that they've absorbed the training and awareness, and doing that on a continuous basis. So you definitely pick up on new ones that come along. And threat exposure management is becoming a thing. If you look at all the hype cycle in security operations, most emerging technology in security operations, as you can see from this, actually relates to different forms of threat exposure management. So you've got your big areas of protection and detection and response, and then this other big area of cybersecurity is exposure management, and there's lots of services and technologies either available or also coming and innovating to help us in this whole space as well. So what's continuous threat exposure management? Well, this is more like a program. It's putting a continuous programmatic wrapper around your threat exposure management. So it's really a program that should exist in most organizations. It's typically kicked off and governed by the GRC aspects of an organization. And it combines the attackers and the defender's view just to continually evaluate and monitor and manage the exposure of the organization. And it's got a number of phases. And I think the key one is the scoping part. Just understanding all your critical assets, your attack surface, and your attack paths. So that scoping, like what are you going to bring into your threat exposure management program to manage under the banner of this? Then you go on and discover all of the assets, discover the vulnerabilities, prioritize, validate, and then mobilise and do that on a continuous basis. According to Gartner, by 2026, organizations using this approach will be 3 times less likely to suffer a breach. So, bold statement from Gartner, but you can see the logic in it. By closing down exposures, you're reducing risk, you're making yourself much more resilient. So, in summary, what I try to get across here is that attackers chain exposures together to achieve their goals. It's really important to expand your concept of exposure way beyond vulnerabilities. really important to understand and identify the full attack surface, both internally and externally. Analyze the attack paths, see those choke points, those areas where you can kill off multiple attack paths in one fell swoop. Really consider putting in place a continuous threat exposure management program so that puts you on that better footing on a continuous basis. And ultimately, you hopefully will become the Chief Exposure Officer of your organization. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much
Thank you.
for that, Brian. Would you mind if we just have a quick look if someone might have a question for you?
Absolutely.
I'll turn out to the audience to see if someone has a question for Brian. I do, so it's fine if you don't. Because then I need to know, there's a lot of exposures that you're talking about. Firstly, I love becoming a CEO, and that's terrific. But looking at all these exposures, how should organization prioritize which to address first?
So I talked earlier in the presentation about criticality of the exposure. So you need to look at what are the most important ones that will mitigate the most risk, and make sure your resources are focused on that. So that's a combination of the likes of asset criticality, exposure in the wild, but crucially understanding how that exposure might be used in multiple attack paths. So I think that point, just to re-emphasize around identifying choke points, so the threat actors, once you choke off this particularly higher priority exposure, then that will significantly reduce your risk of having a very negative outcome. So it's a combination of those factors, I think, that need to be employed. And every organization, it will be different for them depending on their unique environment.
And you mentioned this a bit as well, you were touching upon it, but what are the new exposures out there that you see?
So we're seeing things like cloud is one. So what we're seeing is that the vast majority of breaches in cloud are based on user misconfiguration. So it's not so much that the public cloud providers are making a mistake or being penetrated by attackers, but rather the user has just misconfigured something. So cloud is a huge one. Also, credentials, credential theft is very big as well. Credentials being stolen, leaked on the dark web, and many attackers are using those to launch the likes of password spray attacks on organizations to gain initial access and then moving on from there. OT and IoT is also becoming a lot more common as well. Attackers particularly targeting those environments that are often using legacy systems and operating systems and softwares that have a lot of vulnerabilities as well. So those would be some of the big ones that we're seeing at the moment.
All right. We have a question from a gentleman over here. Do we have a mic? No.
Sure, you can probably hear me. I enjoyed your slide. I thought that was really interesting. Would you also consider that sort of awareness of the people taking part in that was part of what went wrong in terms of they were misled by, like I would say, a con man, right? But these people would consider themselves quite clever. They're very, very well paid. They made a strange decision. I don't think they properly analysed the risk that they were taking. How would you sort of try and communicate that? Because I think the people at that level maybe see themselves above cyber awareness training, things like that. They don't apply to them because they're smart. Do you have sort of different paths or different avenues you take with different sort of levels of leadership when it comes to that?
Yeah, and you're right, and it does, to some extent, start from the top, because if the functional leadership doesn't buy into the concept of the exposures and the risks involved, then it's very hard to convince everybody else within the organization. I think when you go to that more senior level, then you tend to be more focused on business outcomes, and the negative business outcomes that can result from, if you like, the lack of awareness, the lack of hygiene, the lack of exposure management. So I would appeal, I would say appealing to, painting some scenarios of. There's nothing like seeing what's happened to a peer group, a peer organization, or someone at a similar level in a different organization, and how that, we're not immune from these types of attacks either, and therefore, I think paint it in the case of, can you imagine the outcome if such an event happened, and therefore we just have to. It is a case of risk mitigation, so. We perform risk management in many other areas of the business, so equally, if not more importantly, we need to do the same in cybersecurity. So those are some of the approaches I would take with dealing with those type of people within the organization.
Thank you so much, Brian. And I have to let you go to move forward with the agenda, but you will stick around throughout the day, right?
I'll be here all day, yeah.
Perfect. So just grab hold of him if you have any more questions. I'm sorry, we don't have time for more questions on the stage at the moment, but you will be here all day, so grab hold of him. Hang on.